So in terms of what we're doing today, there's a few things planned. Want to talk about and give some updates on the eBay project. And if you saw my notice kind of towards the end of yesterday, there's an updated example project that I put out there called eBayAuth, which should help you get through the open authorization process of your project you're working on. So there's some code there that I've built that you can use that should help you along. So I want to go over that. The next thing we want to talk about is reviewing some of the reading material related to architecture components. So we'll kind of talk through that. The next thing I want to do is I've got a code example kind of built out that uses those architectural materials. So we're going to look at that code example and walk through that. There's no homework today, and as I mentioned, what I want you to be working on is parts 1 through 3 of the eBay Explorer Lab. Okay. Questions right now? Any stumbling blocks that people are having with the project still? I see you, Michael. It's very close to your eyes. But I see you. Okay. Have you gotten any responses at all from support? Has anybody gotten a response from support? Okay. If you can, I would recommend trying to send up a follow-up email, see if they respond. Either way, if you look into the example project that I provided, there are a pair of keys, the client ID and the client secret. So even if you can't get your account working, you should be able to use my account credentials that are provided in that example project to make it work for you. So that should help, and that may just be how we have to work forward with this, is that maybe you're just using my account credentials instead of having access to your own. So that's what I would recommend doing, is using my credentials for this going forward. Okay, so let me take a look at the example project that I put out there at the end of yesterday. I'm going to go ahead and open that up. So that was under that public repo that I put out. So Android Tech News API, I just threw it out there because you already have access to that. So I'm going to go under eBayAuth, open that up, trust the project, use the embedded JDK, and go ahead and start this on my Nexus S emulator. So when you start this up, it should immediately go and generate an auth token here. So what you're seeing on screen is actually a valid application auth token, and you also saw that there was a toast at the bottom that appeared that said it was authenticated. So what I provided in this code is just that example stuff of how you get from the piece of information that you have, the client ID, the client secret, to getting this token, which then you can provide to authenticate your requests. So this will give you that JWT token that you need. So where we're going to start here, and in just starting and looking at the code, if you look into main activity, you'll see really all the code that you care about. All the code that you really care about is in this main activity class. Now, it looks like I'm getting some errors, which shouldn't be. So I'm going to try and rebuild the project to see if I can get those errors to go away. Okay. Well, so much for that then, Michael. Cannot access auth environment. So what is going on here? Okay. I may have to just trigger a change to this so that I can get it to rebuild. Cannot access auth callback. I am not sure why. I have had this problem a little bit lately with Android Studio, in that sometimes when I open up a project or try to access it, it will complain at me here and give me errors where there isn't actually an error, and I'm not entirely sure what is triggering that to happen, but definitely seems to be a bug on the Android Studio side. So if I just make a change and undo it, will it cause it? Yeah. So it just hadn't picked up that the code was actually correct. So I've not actually made any changes to the code. I just made a change to the file and undid it. Okay, so let's kind of walk through what's here. So this is really all you need to know in terms of how to set up and use the code I provided. You'll see that there, in terms of member variables, I've added a link or a place to save this Auth API object, and I've also added a place to store the auth token. That auth token is what you need to provide to your API calls that you're going to make. So what I do in onCreate, first I'm creating this Auth API object. I'm passing it three things. The first is what environment I am in, and that can be either sandbox or production. And so here I'm specifying that it is sandbox. The next thing I'm providing is the client ID and the client secret. So you'll see in there that I've hard-coded my credentials, my client ID, and I've hard-coded my client secret. If you do eventually get an account, you can put yours in there, but for now, just use those credentials that I provided there. So that's how we provide those. And then the next thing I'm doing is calling this method Authenticate Async. So Authenticate Async is going to go asynchronously go ahead and try to authenticate with the server. Go ahead and try to get you a token. If it's successful, this first callback will be called with the response object. That response object includes a few things, such as the expiration date, what kind of token it is, basically all the data that the server comes back with. So I'm just in here, I'm saving the access token to this member variable so that I can access it or utilize it later. You can also see that I'm updating the UI and I'm showing a snack bar. It's worth noting that this callback is called on the main thread, so you don't have to worry about switching between the background and the main threads and the background threads. Same way here. Both of these are actually called on the main thread, so you don't have to deal with any of that there. This second callback is called if anything goes wrong. So if anything goes wrong here, you'll get an authentication exception, which then you can handle and display an error. So for instance here, I'm showing the message auth error in both the main area as well as the snack bar. So if I were to switch this into airplane mode and try to run this again, you would see that there is an exception. Something went wrong because there's no network connection. And you can also look at logcat and see that there should be some errors there reported. So there's actually a stack trace here. We can see that the service failed to get to that. Basically, it couldn't get to the domain name is the long story short. So you can see some information about that from a debugging perspective is kind of logged. And actually, that seems like the wrong thing. So where is my auth error? I need to look for my tag. So look for main activity there. That's what was logged. And I guess I didn't log. Maybe I need to go to Auth API. Okay. So I didn't log everything. I guess I did not log everything that went wrong. Okay. Oh, that's why. Because this should have had a T there. Should be logging the exception. And it wasn't logging the exception, I guess. Although that still seems to not have fixed it. Okay, that may need some more investigation. Anyway, so that's going to tell you there's an error. That's going to tell you that it successfully got a token. So for the most part, that's really all you'll need. In terms of authentication, is just to create an Auth API object and then tell it to authenticate asynchronous when you get connected to the network. So that's most of what this is really all the code that you'll really need to know about. This class that is in here, this is connecting into there's two other classes that are provided in addition to main activity. There's an auth environment file here, as well as an Auth API file. Both of these classes, Auth environment and Auth API, you should be able to just pick up and drop into your project, and they should work without necessarily needing to do much of anything else. They do rely on retrofit as well as JSON. So there are 3 dependencies that are in this project. Namely, I ended up needing retrofit, the retrofit converter for JSON, as well as JSON itself to make all of this code work. So you'll end up needing to have all 3 of those dependencies in order for you to use this example code. I'm going to go ahead and add that here just as a reminder in and Discord. The reason for the addition of JSON is I ended up needing to do something directly with JSON in terms of handling the error case, and so I had actually used the JSON parser directly rather than just through the converter. So let's look at a little bit about what's in these 2 classes. I don't want to get into too deep because the details of them are not as important. But they do serve as some example code for things you might want to do with your other things. I wouldn't necessarily say, hands down, I wouldn't say you need to follow the patterns that I've used here, but you can kind of see how I've done things if it gives you some ideas, but definitely don't need to stick to this because I'm doing intentionally some kind of advanced things. So first thing here, the auth environment, you'll notice is actually not a class, it's an enum. So in the world of Java, just like many other languages, you can create enumerations. Java enumerations are a little bit different than other languages, namely in that in the world of Java, enumerations are not integers. So like in C# and C++ and other languages, typically enumerations are just an integer. But in the world of Java, your enumerations are actually objects. So this is actually more akin to a class. One distinction, though, is you can't subclass an enum inherently because it's supposed to determine that there's only certain values. So specifically, we're saying, hey, there's two environments, right? There's two environments with eBay. So eBay has a sandbox environment and eBay has a production environment. And so I'm declaring that this first part is just declaring those two enum values, sandbox and production. Those effectively turn out as like static variables, static instances that appear where you can say auth environment.sandbox or auth environment.production, and you'll get the relevant enum object. You'll notice inside of both of these that I'm providing some arguments. Those arguments are actually to the constructor, because in the world of Java, you can actually have a constructor in your enums. So here we have instance variables. So these are instance variables that are become properties of the actual enum object. So both of the sandbox and the production have a host property, a base URL property, and an auth URL property. You can see the constructor here for this enum object. It takes the host, the base URL, saves it to there. So this is not too terribly complicated. You just have a few instance variables, and you have and a constructor. It's worth noting that these are intentionally final so that they can't be changed afterward, because inherently with an enum, you don't want that data to allow changes. They're supposed to be immutable objects. But that lets me store more things with these enums, such as the host and the base URL, which I'll be using in a minute. Okay, so this may be helpful for you just to be able to quickly look up that base URL, is you can use this auth environment object with other things you're doing. But that was a quick way to store that data. Next, looking into the Auth API class itself, you'll see that it's just a simple class. It doesn't inherit from anything. You'll see that there is, like I've done with other things, I've got a log tag in here. So login goes into that Auth API tag. I've got some instance variables here. So I've got a reference to the base URL. I'm remembering the client ID, the client secret. I've got a reference to the retrofit object as well as the service class. So we'll kind of look through that. You'll notice that it's got two constructors. So this first constructor takes an environment, a client ID, and a client secret. The second one just takes a base URL, client ID, and a client secret. So these are what we call overloaded constructors. They just take different arguments, right? So in one, the first argument is an environment. In the second one, there is a base URL. That means that you can construct it either way. If you want to use you can use the environment to go access the base URL, or if for whatever reason something happens and this is a way to kind of future-proof things. If maybe the base URL was wrong, well then you could still pass in a different base URL if you needed to. So that way you don't have to strictly necessarily update auth environment if it becomes out of date. So I saved the base URL. This one is very short. This one, you'll see that the keyword this, when you see the keyword this like this is saying, actually, I want to call another constructor. So this constructor is actually calling the other constructor. And you'll notice the difference is it says, let's take the environment.base URL, the base URL that is part of that environment object, and pass it down as an argument to the second one. Just pass the client ID and client secret through. That way I get the benefit of kind of both of these constructors without having to duplicate a lot of code. If I didn't do this trick, then I'd be having to duplicate a lot of this code up here in this constructor as well. So commonly you'll see that when you have overloaded constructors. All but one of them will contain very little code because most of the other constructors are just calling down to one constructor in particular. So in this constructor, we take those three arguments. I just simply save them as instance fields. You'll notice the keyword this to distinguish between the thing on the left is the instance field versus this is a local variable or a parameter to the function. You'll see that I am then creating this retrofit object we talked about yesterday with retrofit. That's kind of step one when you want to connect to or use retrofit as an HTTP client. So I'm constructing that using the base URL as well as the JSON converter. And then I'm also creating the service here as well using retrofit.create. And I'm using this auth service interface. Now, to try and keep the code small and in such a way that you can easily copy it into your project, traditionally I would add put a lot of these things into separate files where all my interfaces and all my classes would be in a separate file. But I determined after kind of playing around with it and thinking about how to get this into your projects, like, well, it probably would be easier if I just nest a lot of these things inside of this Auth API class. So if you expand Auth API, you'll see that there's a bunch of nested interfaces and classes that are all related to this and make it work. And that's as opposed to storing them as separate files. So scrolling down and skipping a little bit, you'll see that there's my service definition. So remember, that's part of what we had to define working with retrofit. You have to define what are the API endpoints that are available. So I'm saying that there's an API endpoint at identity v1 auth2 token that accepts a post request. The data that we're posting is going to be form URL encoded. I'm passing two headers, namely I'm saying that this accepts as a response, it accepts JSON as a response, or expects JSON as a response, and the user agent string is going to be set as retrofit, and that just kind of identifies what kind of client is connecting to the server. The next thing we have in here is that we actually are defining the method. So the method is called authenticate. You can see that it's returning a call auth response. So auth response is how I'm modeling the data that I expect to get back from the server. Specifically, that data is coming back from the server as a JSON object. So I looked at that JSON response and figured out, okay, here are the things that we need to return. And we can see that there is an authorization header that has to be passed to the server to authenticate yourself. It takes as far as a field, you can kind of think this as a form field named grant type. And so I need to pass that in. And it also takes another form field called scope. So those are the three required input: is the authorization header, the grant type field, as well as a scope field. Okay, we'll come back and look other place in the code to kind of see how that's built and how that's generated. But that's the definition of my service. My service, as far as authentication, there's really only one endpoint, so there's only one function in there, but you'll see there's a few more annotations that I had to add because it is a more complex sort of endpoint. Okay, so that's the service. So we can come back to the constructor and we can see, okay, we created that service. That's the end of that. So that's as far as what's happening with the constructor. Really, we're just saving the base URL. We're constructing the retrofit object as well as creating a service. When you want to actually initiate an authentication request, that can happen two ways. Retrofit's got, as you read from the documentation, there is a synchronous API as well as an asynchronous API. So I have built the code in here to support both of those pathways. If you need to connect and get your auth tokens synchronously, you can call Authenticate Sync, or if you need to do it asynchronously, you can call Authenticate Async. So I provided a method and a pathway for both ways. Depending on how your application is set up, you may need one or the other. I would recommend trying to recommend going down the asynchronous route, which is why when I implemented main activity, that's the route that I took, is the asynchronous route of this. But this is also a possibility as well, depending on how you're doing things. You may need one or the other. So let's look at Authenticate Async and just see what that is doing. So in terms of Authenticate Async, you'll see that it's taking two callbacks. One is the auth callback, one is the auth failure callback. You'll remember when we looked at main activity, those were the two functions that we passed in, right? So here's the auth callback, here is the auth failure callback. So what happens when it's successful? What happens when it's failed? So I passed both of those in. I create a call using this authenticate method. So let me go scroll up and see what happens there. So there's a little bit of processing that we have to do in order to actually initiate a request. And so part of that process is we actually have to take the credentials and get them into the format that eBay's Auth API is expecting. And so specifically what it's expecting is that we're passing the credentials, the client ID and the client secret in the authorization header. But they have to be encoded a certain way. So if you look at the documentation, and I think I can bring that up here, I just need to go back to the lab. And, oh, yes, I was looking for under Auth access tokens. Client grant flow. Okay. So it said, you know, in the doc, if you're looking at the documentation, this is where I got that URL what the URL needs to be is post request. There I've got, you know, about, hey, I need to send the data, those two form fields as URL encoded. But here it mentions, this is what we're talking about now, is that the authorization header needs to be started with type basic. Basic meaning that basically you're providing a username and password pair. And then how that needs to be encoded. So it specifically says it's the client ID followed by a colon followed by the client secret. Take that, and then you have to Base64 encode that. Okay. Now, what is Base64 encoding? Base64 encoding takes a series of bytes. It's actually interesting. It takes a series of bytes, not a series of characters, but it takes a series of bytes, and it will use 64 characters that typically are URL safe. So that's like all the numbers, the lowercase letters, the uppercase letters, as well as usually 2 or 3 characters to pad it out to the 64. So we'll choose from those just 64 characters to encode the data here. So we have to figure out how to do that, and so that's part of the challenge of how do we provide the credentials. Is how do we do this Base64 encoding? And so that's one of the reasons I wanted to provide you a code example, because Base64 is really not something you've seen before, and there are some gotchas when you're trying to do Base64 in Java specifically. So in terms of getting those things into Base64 encoding, you'll see that there's really 4 lines of code here that are doing that job. The first thing I have to do is actually get the UTF-8 character set, and so I can get that from standard character sets.utf8. So that gives me the UTF-8 kind of character encoding. If I wanted to encode this as UTF-16 or ASCII or something else, I would use a different encoding there. But because what most web servers expect is UTF-8, I'm using UTF-8. And so it doesn't really say that you need to use UTF-8 in their documentation, but that is one of the expectations that their OAuth is expecting. So we need that. And so next thing I'm doing here is I'm building out that string. So take the client ID plus the colon plus the client secret, and you'll notice that these 2 variables are coming from the instance variables that we saved up here earlier in the constructor. So I'm putting that together to get a string. I have to then, one step I have to do is I have to get that string into an array of bytes. The reason being, again, because Base64 encodes an array of bytes, it can't encode a string directly. You have to get to a byte and then encode that byte array. So to get it to a byte array, I take the string, I call getBytes, then pass in that encoding, that character set. So I say encode this string using that UTF-8 character set. Okay, so that gives me the array of bytes I need. I can then say use this Base64 class, which is actually, interestingly, that Base64 class is part of Android. It's actually not part of the standard Java APIs, because it turns out that Java out of the box doesn't actually have a standard Base64 encoding class. It's actually something you have to pull from a third-party code oftentimes. So anyways, I'm using this Base64 class to encode it. I say encode the string. It needs two things. It needs, first of all, that array of bytes, which I'm providing, which we previously had encoded using UTF-8. And then I need to provide it some options. And so specifically, I have to provide it Base64 no wrap. The reason for that is this string is long enough that if you don't specify no wrap, you just leave it at the default, there'll actually be a line break in the middle of the produced string, the produced Base64 encoding, and that breaks actually the header. The header has to be all on one line. So that's why I'm specifying no wrap, is to say no matter how long the string comes out, don't break it, don't put any new lines into the output, keep it all on one line. So that's how I do the Base64 encoding. I then am going to put that together to create the authorization header, which is the keyword basic, has to start at the beginning. You'll notice that there's a space there intentionally as well, basic space, and then that string that I produced up here. So that will give me the authorization header that I'm sending to the server to authenticate. Now, it's worth mentioning that this authorization header is the one you use for using the Auth API versus if you want to then later use the Browse API, it's actually a different header. So once you want to use the Browse API, it's actually bearer space and then the auth token that you got from this process, not this UTF-8 bit, not this Base64 encoding bit. That only exists in this particular case. This is only for this API endpoint. The other API endpoints are different. So that's one thing. That's how I'm building out that whole process, is how do we get the authorization header that's needed. The next thing is the grant type specifically is going to be client credentials. And if you read through the documentation here, you'll find that specifically they say as far as a request body, the field you're just always going to send client credentials. That's the value. They also mention that you need to send a scope. And they say that this can be a list of scopes. Their URL, they need to be URL encoded and then separated by spaces. So that's data we have to provide to the server. The good news about the URL encoding is that Retrofit already takes care of the URL encoding, so I don't have to do that. It will go ahead and take what I've provided as a scope and URL encode it for me, because I've specified down here that all of these form fields are URL encoded. So that ensures that those two things, both the grant type and the scope, get URL encoded where they need to be. Okay, so those get URL encoded, and then if I needed other scopes, I would separate those by spaces. From my testing, this seemed to be the only scope that you needed in order to actually use the Browse API. So if you needed to use other APIs at some point, you may need to add additional scopes. But I believe this is the only one we need for right now. So I just hard-coded in the required scope there. It's interesting to note that it's always api.ebay.com, regardless of whether or not if you're on the sandbox environment or the production environment. It seems to be the same scope that's needed for basic API access. So that's how we build that out. I then say service and authenticate. So this is where I'm going down and calling that that service class that we have. That produces a call object, which I'm returning. So this whole method is really just around getting the data into the format that it needs to be, and doing that processing so that I can have that kind of in one place. Because it turns out I need to call this authenticate method both from here and there. This, however, is private, so it's not the method that you should be calling. Externally, if you're trying to use my Auth API class, you would be using one of these two, Authenticate Async and Authenticate Sync. So that's intentionally private. So the first thing to do is produce the actual request. The next thing I do is call.enqueue. I may have talked about previously, you can do call.execute. Call.execute will run it synchronously. In this case, I'm trying to run it asynchronously. So if you want to make an asynchronous request with retrofit, you do that with call.enqueue. Now, call.enqueue takes a callback object. So it takes a retrofit callback. And so that method, that's an interface that I need to implement. You'll see that it takes specifically auth response is what I'm looking as the response. You have to implement two methods for that callback. You have to implement an onResponse method as well as an onFailure method. So onResponse is what happens when it's successful. OnFailure is what happens if something goes wrong. So I'm saying in the onResponse case, first of all, let's try to process it, figure out if it's good. You'll notice I'm calling down to this method called handle response, which is where actually most of the bulk of the work is. And so I pass the call, like pass the response, I call that method. If it's successful, it will return the response. And then I just simply call this successful, this callback with that response. If there's an exception along the way, then I'm going to call the failure callback with that exception. So if it's successful, we go here to callback. If it's unsuccessful, we go to callback fail. That's because there's a few more things I have to check. That even though the server says, hey, yes, you got a response, there still may be more issues, which mean that we actually didn't get an auth token. So that's part of what I'm having to deal with there. On the flip side, if we get a failure, then we just strictly go to calling that failure callback. We just say, hey, let's create a new auth exception with the information from that throwable that was provided. Just a side note, throwable is actually the base class for exceptions. So exception is actually a subclass of throwable. So in a lot of ways, this throwable is kind of basically behaves like an exception. You can treat this throwable as if it were an exception. So that's kind of what I'm doing, is creating a new auth exception, using the message as the message for that exception, as well as saying, hey, this was caused by this other exception here, this T. So that's what I'm doing there. So let's look at hand response. So things I need to check. First thing I need to check is actually on the response, I need to call is successful. Is successful, we'll check the status code that came back from the response. So typically when we're talking about HTTP, status codes from 200 to 299 are considered successful, whereas things in other ranges are often maybe unsuccessful. So remember, 200 to 299 is successful. 300 to 399 is a redirect. 400 to 499 is the 400 level is a client-side error, and 500 to 599, the 500 level, is a server-side error. So oftentimes you'll get errors in the 400 level and the 500 level that indicate that something went wrong. So only if the server said this was a successful response is when I'm going to say, okay, let's return the body because it went through successfully. If it wasn't successful, if we didn't get that 200 status code, then we're falling down here and doing some additional logic. And so that's to try and provide you some additional information about what specifically went wrong on the server side. Like what is the data that the server returned if you're trying to troubleshoot it. So I'm saying, first of all, let's say the error message is status plus the response code. So say we get a 404 error, it's going to return as like the message is just going to be status 404, saying, hey, it couldn't find that endpoint. Or if it's a 401, it would be status 401, saying like you weren't authenticated, things like that. So I'm using that to generate an error message. I'm also going in here, sometimes depending on how it fails, the server actually does return a body in the response. The gotcha is that body, that error body, you can't actually get through response.body. You have to get that response through response.error body. An error body isn't automatically parsed by retrofit, so you have to manually parse that error body. So here I'm actually creating a JSON parser. I'm saying if there is a body to parse, then let's go ahead and try to parse it using JSON. So JSON from JSON, I take the response.errorbody.the character stream, so provide that stream of data to JSON. I have to tell it that I want to try and interpret that JSON data as an auth failure response object. So that's what I want it to parse into. And then if that was successful, we did get a response body parsed, and that response has an error message. Then the error message will come back as a combination of two things. It will come back as the error followed by a colon and the error description. So that way you can get to the error that the server will return, because sometimes things happen there depending on how you sent it. So for instance, if you send a invalid you send an invalid client ID or client secret, it actually does fall into this pathway and return an error message for you to look at. So that's really, this is all about just trying to produce, give you back the information that the server provided, so that it's easier to debug and figure out what's going on and try to troubleshoot any errors with your authentication. So really, that's all that it is about, is producing this error message. Last things I will mention, you'll notice in this Authenticate Async that there are a pair of callbacks that we passed in. Those I've defined down here. So auth callback and auth failure callback. You'll see they're both interfaces. Because basically I want to provide lambdas. So in order to provide lambdas, you need to define an interface for that lambda, and that interface needs to have exactly one method. So that's what we have here. There's an on-auth method and an on-failure method. So those two interfaces are needed to make those callbacks work, those lambdas work that are in main activity. You'll also see down here that there are two objects. There's the auth response. So that's what the server returns when this is successful. So it returns an access token, a token type, and expires in. Expires in, as you can see, is an integer. The other two types are strings. Versus when it fails, it will sometimes produce an error and an error description. So I've got two different model classes there. And finally, I also have a custom exception subclass, so that when this fails, you get specifically an auth exception rather than just any other kind of exception. So you can say, okay, specifically, I know something happened with authentication if I got an auth exception. So that's an override of exception. Subclass of exception has two constructors, one that takes a message, one that takes a message and throwable, and those are both calling down to the base constructors on exception. All three of these, you might notice, have the keyword static on them. This is a static class. If you mark a class static, specifically that means that that works on a nested class and says that that class does not have a reference to the object it's in. So by marking these classes as static, I'm saying it doesn't have a reference to the Auth API object, which is basically makes it behave, by marking these classes static, means it behaves just like if I had it in a separate file, rather than behaving like how a nested class normally behaves. Okay. So that's kind of the quick overview of everything that's happening with the Auth API. Again, large in part, all you'll need to do is kind of look at what's in the main activity code, and either call Authenticate Async or call Authenticate Sync. But I wanted to do an overview of some of the code that was in there. So, questions? So the main takeaway from this is that you're going to take the auth environment enum here, as well as the Auth API from this example project. You're going to copy both of those two files in your eBay project, and that should help you deal with this authentication process.